You may not have been aware of these professions in ancient Egypt, but they were of great significance during that historical period. I will now share information that you will not find in your school history textbooks. We will take a look behind the scenes of history and see that Egyptian society was much more complex and multifaceted than is commonly believed. It lived, breathed, and worked to a rhythm set not only by great construction projects, but also by thousands of inconspicuous yet vitally important crafts. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn which profession was considered so honorable that its representatives were allowed to touch the pharaoh while performing a very personal and unexpected task. What I am about to show you was normal in ancient Egypt, but today it may seem strange and even shocking. In ancient Egyptian society, the passage to the afterlife was a matter of paramount importance, accompanied by complex and expensive rituals. To emphasize the status of the deceased and the depth of his family's grief, special people were hired, professional mourners. These were women whose job was to demonstrate grief in public. They accompanied the funeral procession, crying loudly, sprinkling ashes on their heads, and performing ritual gestures of mourning. Their task was to create an atmosphere of universal sadness and loss. The richer and more noble the family, the more mourners they could afford. Sometimes there were dozens of them, turning the funeral into a theatrical performance. Their services were expensive, but they were considered a necessary investment in the deceased's peaceful afterlife. Frescoes and tombs depict images of these women. They are shown with their hair loose and in simple clothes to emphasize their state of grief. Their poses and gestures were strictly canonical and passed down from generation to generation. The work of mourners required not only acting skills but also physical endurance. Funeral processions could last for hours under the scorching sun. All this time, they had to continuously portray inconsolable grief. These women were not relatives of the deceased. They were hired workers doing their job. Immediately after the ritual was over, their mourning ceased and they returned to their normal lives. It was a job like any other. The existence of such a profession says a lot about the worldview of the Egyptians. For them, the outward display of emotions and observance of ritual were no less important than sincere feelings. A properly organized funeral was considered a guarantee of eternal life. Interestingly, this tradition was not unique to Egypt and was found in various forms in other ancient cultures. However, it was in Egypt that it reached such scale and official status. This craft was a respected and necessary element of social life. It may be difficult for modern people to understand how mourning could be performed for a fee. This raises interesting questions about the nature of emotions and social rituals. We would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this profession? Was it a sign of respect for the deceased or just a formality? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most influential profession in ancient Egypt, which had nothing to do with physical strength? While most Egyptians were engaged in hard physical labor, there was a caste of people whose position was exceptionally privileged. These people were scribes, masters of hieroglyphics, and keepers of knowledge. Becoming a scribe was the dream of many, but the path to this profession was long and difficult. Training began at an early age, around 5 or 6 years old, and could last more than 10 years. Boys learned the complex system of hieroglyphic and hieratic writing. Their school days were filled with endless exercises. Students copied ancient texts, teachings, and hymns, honing their skills. Instead of expensive papyrus, they used cheap clay shards and limestone fragments called ostraca as drafts. The scribe's tools were simple but functional. He carried a special case with reed pens, 2 cups for black and red ink, and a vessel for water. This set was his constant companion and a symbol of his status. Once he had mastered literacy, the scribe became part of the state apparatus. Doors to any sphere of life were open to him. Scribes served in temples, in the army, at the courts of nobles, and the pharaoh himself. They kept records of harvests, compiled tax lists, and copied laws and religious texts. Without their painstaking work, the administration of a huge and complex state would have been simply impossible. They were the nervous system of ancient Egyptian civilization. The position of scribe exempted him from physical labor and the payment of taxes in the form of work. Texts from that time often contain a lesson in which a father persuades his son to study to become a scribe, describing all the hardships of peasant or artisan life. Being a scribe meant being a respected and well-off person. They were not just copyists, but bearers of culture and traditions. Thanks to their work, the myths, fairy tales, medical treatises, and historical chronicles of ancient Egypt have come down to us. It was they who preserved the heritage of their great civilization for posterity. Their work required not only literacy, but also knowledge of mathematics, law, and administration. The best scribes could attain the highest positions in the state, becoming viziers or high priests. Literacy was the most reliable social ladder of that era. But if scribes were the elite, the next profession we will discuss was one of the most unusual and personal services that could be provided to a person. Read on to the next chapter to find out how the desire to look beautiful in a desert climate gave rise to an entire industry. Right now, I'm going to reveal the most closely guarded beauty secret of the ancient Egyptians, which was dictated by harsh necessity. In Egypt's hot climate, maintaining hair hygiene was extremely difficult. Therefore, both men and women from the upper classes preferred to shave their heads and wear wigs on top. This solution was not only practical, but also a status symbol. The wig protected the head from the scorching sun and made it easy to keep clean. At the same time, an elaborate and expensive wig demonstrated the wealth and high status of its owner. Wig making was a complex and respected craft. Master wig makers created true masterpieces from various materials. The most expensive wigs were made from natural human hair. Sheep's wool or plant fibers, such as palm leaves, were used to create cheaper alternatives. These materials were dyed dark colors, most often black, which was considered the standard of beauty. The basis for the wig was a special frame cap woven from fabric. Hair or fibers were attached to this base strand by strand. They were styled into complex hairstyles, braided into pigtails, and decorated with decorative elements. Beeswax and resins were used to fix the shape. There was a huge variety of wig styles. There were short, practical models for everyday wear, and huge, lush ones for special occasions. The shape of the wig could indicate a person's social status and occupation. For example, warriors had their own types of wigs, officials had theirs, and priests had completely different ones. The pharaoh wore a special royal wig, which was part of his divine attire. Women's wigs were particularly exquisite, often with long curls and intricate weaves. Wig makers were in high demand. They worked in workshops attached to temples or in the palaces of nobles. Their art required tremendous patience, precision, and artistic taste. Caring for wigs was also a separate task. They had to be regularly cleaned, combed, and styled. For this purpose, there were special stands on which wigs were stored when not being worn. This beauty industry was an integral part of the life of the Egyptian elite. It demonstrates how important appearance and status symbols were to them. A wig was not just an accessory, but an important element of the identity of the ancient Egyptian. What if I told you that one of the most important professions in Egypt was related to a drink you know well? For the ancient Egyptians, beer was not just a drink to quench their thirst or entertain themselves. It was one of the staple foods, liquid bread, which was part of the daily diet of all segments of the population. Beer was so important that it was used as currency. The builders of pyramids and tombs, as well as other government workers, were paid not in money but in food. The standard ration included bread, vegetables, and several liters of beer per day. The profession of brewer was very common and respected. Beer was brewed both in small households for personal use and in huge industrial breweries attached to temples and palaces. These breweries produced beer for thousands of people. The beer-making technology differed from modern methods. The Egyptians made it from special, slightly undercooked barley or wheat bread. This bread was crumbled, poured over with water, and left to ferment in large clay vessels. The fermentation process was carried out by wild yeast contained in the air and on the surface of the vessels. The resulting wort was then filtered to separate the liquid from the solid particles. The finished beer was thick, cloudy, and very nutritious. There were many varieties of beer, which differed in taste, color, and strength. There was sweet beer, thick beer, beer for offerings, and even special varieties for religious holidays. The names of some of them have come down to us in written sources. Brewers were true masters of their craft. They had to precisely control the temperature, proportions of ingredients, and fermentation time. The quality of the final product, which was vital to the whole community, depended on their skill. The work of a brewer was physically demanding. It required grinding grain, kneading dough, baking bread, and carrying heavy vessels of water and beer. Breweries were hot and humid places. Despite this, it was an honorable profession. Brewers provided people with one of their main sources of calories and an integral part of their culture. Without beer, life in ancient Egypt would have been simply unthinkable. How different do you think ancient Egyptian beer was from modern beer? In ancient Egypt, great importance was attached to the cleanliness of the body and clothing. This was not only due to hygiene in a hot climate, but also to religious beliefs. It was believed that cleanliness was pleasing to the gods, so priests and ordinary Egyptians tried to maintain a neat appearance. Egyptians wore clothes made mainly of linen, which was the ideal material for the local climate. White was considered a symbol of cleanliness and was the most common color. However, keeping linen garments white was no easy task. For this purpose, there was a whole cast of professionals, laundrymen or foulons. Their work was one of the hardest and least prestigious, but absolutely necessary. They were responsible for washing clothes for wealthy houses, temples, and palaces. Their main place of work was the banks of the Nile. Laundrymen collected dirty laundry from their clients and took it to the river. There they stood in the water for hours, beating the clothes on flat stones. They used natron, a natural soda mined in the desert, as a detergent. Natron has excellent cleaning and bleaching properties. They also used a special clay that absorbed grease and dirt. After washing, the clothes were thoroughly rinsed in river water. Then they were dried in the sun, spread out on hot sand, or hung on tree branches. The sun's rays further bleached the fabric. The final stage was ironing. Instead of irons, the Egyptians used heavy, smooth stones or special wooden devices. After such treatment, the clothes became smooth and neat. The work of a laundress was exhausting and monotonous. It required great physical strength and endurance. In addition, constant exposure to water was associated with certain risks. Despite all the difficulties, these people performed a vital function. They maintained the standards of cleanliness that were so important to Egyptian society. Without their unnoticed labor, the life of the Egyptian elite would have been very different. Fullers usually worked in groups, forming a kind of professional guild. They passed their craft down from generation to generation. Their work, though not prestigious, provided them with a stable, albeit modest, income. Are you ready for the shocking truth about ancient Egyptian medicine? We tend to think of ancient medicine as a mixture of superstition and primitive practices. However, Egyptian doctors, or Sunu, possessed knowledge that was, in some areas, far ahead of its time. Egyptian medicine was closely intertwined with magic and religion. The Egyptians believed that many ailments were caused by evil spirits or the wrath of the gods. Therefore, treatment often included not only medicines, but also spells, amulets, and rituals. Despite this, doctors also possessed practical skills. They knew how to perform simple surgical operations, set dislocations, and apply splints to fractures. Their surgical instruments, made of bronze, were quite diverse and functional. One source of their knowledge was the practice of embalming. Although embalmers and doctors were representatives of different professions, the knowledge of the former about anatomy undoubtedly influenced the latter. Doctors had an understanding of the internal structure of the human body. There was a remarkable degree of specialization for that time. There were doctors who treated only eye diseases, dentists, and specialists in digestion. Herodotus wrote that in Egypt, every doctor treats only one disease. Dental practices were particularly advanced. Doctors knew how to drill teeth, drain abscesses, and even create prostheses by fastening fallen teeth to adjacent ones with gold wire. These were cutting-edge technologies for the ancient world. Doctors had an extensive arsenal of medicines at their disposal. They used hundreds of recipes based on plants, minerals, and animal products. Many of these recipes are recorded in medical papyri, such as the famous Ebers Papyrus. The medical profession was highly respected. Many doctors served at the court of the pharaoh and nobles. Training was long and took place in special schools called houses of life, which were usually located near temples. Doctors understood the importance of hygiene and diet. They gave patients recommendations on nutrition and lifestyle. This demonstrates a comprehensive approach to health. Which of their methods do you think were truly effective? For the ancient Egyptians, the boundary between the world of humans and the world of the gods was very thin. Dreams were considered one of the main channels of communication with the divine world. Dreams were not just a figment of the imagination, but were perceived as important messages, omens, or warnings. Since dreams were encrypted messages, specialists were needed who could interpret them correctly. This role was assigned to dream interpreters, who were most often priests with special knowledge. Their profession was extremely important and responsible. Everyone turned to them, from simple peasants to the pharaoh himself. It was believed that the ruler's dreams could predict the fate of the entire country. Therefore, interpreting the pharaoh's dreams was a matter of national importance. Interpreters did not rely solely on their intuition. They had special books at their disposal, dream books. These papyri contained lists of various dreams and their interpretations. The structure of dream books was simple and logical. First, the dream was described, for example, if a person sees in a dream how he eats crocodile meat. Then came the interpretation. This is good. It means that he will get a position as an official. The interpretations were divided into good and bad. If the dream foreshadowed something bad, the interpreter might advise performing a special ritual. This ritual was intended to ward off impending disaster. The profession of interpreter required not only knowledge of sacred texts, but also a deep understanding of psychology. He had to be a good listener and know how to ask the right questions. Often his advice helped a person to understand his own anxieties and fears. Dream interpreters worked at temples, which were considered places of power and connection with the gods. People came to the temple to spend the night there in the hope of having a prophetic dream. In the morning, they told it to the priest interpreter. This process was called dream incubation and was a common practice. It was believed that in a sacred place, the gods were more likely to send a person an answer to their question. The temples of the god of wisdom, Thoth, and the goddess of healing, Isis, were especially popular for this purpose. The work of dream interpreters shows how deeply religious beliefs permeated all aspects of Egyptian life. For them, the invisible world was as real as the visible one, and specialists who knew how to navigate this world were held in high esteem. There were many positions at the pharaoh's court, each with its own duties and privileges. Some of them may seem insignificant to us today, but for the Egyptians they were full of deep meaning. One of these surprising professions was pharaoh's sandal bearer. At first glance, this job seems simple and even humiliating. This person's duty was to carry the ruler's sandals. However, in reality, it was one of the most honorable and trusted positions at court. Sandals in ancient Egypt were not just footwear, but an important status symbol. Commoners walked barefoot. Only the nobility and officials could afford to wear sandals, and the higher their status, the more luxurious their footwear. The pharaoh's sandals were the ultimate symbol of his power over the land of Egypt. Therefore, the person entrusted with carrying them had to have an impeccable reputation. He was not just a servant, but a close associate of the ruler. The sandal bearer constantly accompanied the pharaoh on all his campaigns, ceremonies, and trips. He was one of the few who had the right to be in close proximity to the divine person of the ruler. This gave him enormous influence at court. This position was often just the first step in a brilliant career. Many of the sandal bearers eventually held high positions in the army or in state administration. It was an excellent opportunity to prove their loyalty and earn the pharaoh's trust. Many reliefs and frescoes depict the sandal bearer. He always stands behind the pharaoh, holding the precious shoes in his hands. He often also carries a vessel with water for washing the ruler's feet. This profession required not only loyalty, but also physical strength and endurance. Constantly following the pharaoh, often under the scorching sun, was a serious challenge. But the prestige and opportunities that this position offered were worth it. The existence of such a profession perfectly illustrates the hierarchical nature of Egyptian society. Every aspect of life, even the most insignificant at first glance, was strictly regulated, and proximity to the pharaoh's body was the highest value. Thus, the sandal bearer was not just a servant. He was the keeper of an important symbol of power and a confidant of the most powerful man in Egypt. It was a profession that many could only dream of. The ancient Egyptians paid great attention to their appearance and personal care. Archaeological finds and images in tombs indicate that caring for fingernails and toenails was an important part of the life of the Egyptian elite. There were special masters for this. The profession of manicurist and pedicurist was respected enough to be mentioned in the tombs of high-ranking officials. For example, in Saqqara, the tomb of two men was found who bore the title guardians and masters of the pharaoh's nails. This suggests that they were the personal masters of the ruler himself. Their work was not limited to cutting and polishing nails. They also massaged hands and feet using various oils and incense. It was a relaxing and pleasant procedure. Special tools were used to care for the nails. Archaeologists have found small bronze knives, nail files, and tweezers that were part of the cosmetic kits of that time. These tools were very similar to modern ones. The Egyptians also practiced nail painting. For this, they used henna, a natural dye that gave a reddish-brown tint. The color of the nails could indicate social status. It is believed that members of the upper nobility painted their nails in bright, rich colors. People of lower status used pale shades. Well-groomed and painted nails were a sign that their owner was not engaged in physical labor. Interestingly, this profession was not exclusively female. As the example of the tomb in Saqqara shows, men who served other high-ranking men were often men themselves. This was the norm in ancient Egyptian society. Any large centralized state needs resources to exist. Ancient Egypt was no exception. Building temples, maintaining an army, and keeping the bureaucracy running required a well-oiled tax collection system. In Egypt, money as we understand it today did not yet exist, so taxes were paid in kind. Peasants gave part of their grain harvest, cattle breeders gave part of their livestock, and artisans gave part of their products. This system was called shamu, which can be translated as harvest or collection. Tax collectors were responsible for organizing this complex process. They were government officials, most often from the caste of scribes, as their work required strict accountability. They were key figures in the country's economic system. Tax collectors traveled throughout the country, from village to village, assessing the amount of tax for each household. The amount of land tax, for example, depended on the size of the field and the height of the Nile flood in a given year. The higher the flood, the more fertile the land and the higher the tax. The work of a tax collector was difficult and often dangerous. Not everyone was happy to give up part of their hard-earned labor. Therefore, tax collectors were often accompanied by guards consisting of soldiers or special police. All the collected products, grain, livestock, fabrics, honey, wine, went to state and temple warehouses. These warehouses were a kind of bank and treasury of ancient Egypt. From there, resources were distributed for the needs of the state. It was from these reserves that workers were paid, the army was supplied, and religious festivals were organized. Without the effective work of tax collectors, the entire Egyptian civilization would have simply collapsed. Their labor was the foundation on which the greatness of the pharaohs rested. Tax collectors kept detailed records on papyrus. They accounted for every measure of grain and every head of cattle. Thanks to these documents, modern historians can reconstruct the economic life of ancient Egypt. We have taken a journey into the world of ancient Egyptian professions and seen how diverse and amazing it was. From mourning actors to keepers of royal sandals, from wig makers to master brewers, each profession was an important part of the complex mechanism that was Egyptian civilization. These people, whose names are mostly lost to history, created through their daily labor the greatness that we admire today. Their stories show us that behind the facade of monumental monuments, there are always the lives of ordinary people with their concerns, ambitions, and crafts. By studying their professions, we begin to better understand not only the economy and everyday life, but also the very worldview of this great civilization, where each person had their own specific place and function. What other secrets of the past would you like to uncover? Perhaps you are interested in the secrets of medieval castle construction or the daily life of a Roman legionnaire? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research.